The fire at Station 47 was the kind that left scars, not just on the building, but on the people who called it home. It was a three-alarm blaze that gutted the engine bay, melted the lockers, and turned the dormitories into charred husks. The official report cited faulty wiring, but whispers among the crew suggested otherwise. At the center of it all was Jake Lawson, a seasoned firefighter with a reputation for bravery and a spotless record. He had been first on the scene, battling the inferno with a determination that bordered on obsession. But when the smoke cleared and the investigators arrived, fingers began to point. Evidence surfaced, an accelerant found near Jake's locker, a suspicious transaction in his bank account, and a series of anonymous tips that painted him as the arsonist. The department moved swiftly. Jake was suspended, then terminated. The media had a field day, plastering his face across headlines and labeling him a disgraced hero. Jake's world crumbled. His wife left, taking their 2 children with her. Friends turned their backs. The community he had served now saw him as a pariah. He retreated into isolation, haunted by the betrayal and the unanswered question: who had set him up? Years passed. Jake took odd jobs, keeping a low profile. But the fire inside him never died. He spent countless nights poring over the case files, the evidence, and the inconsistencies. Patterns emerged, details that had been overlooked or dismissed. He began to suspect that the real culprits were closer than he had ever imagined. 3 names stood out: Mike Harris, Tom Delgado, and Steve Reynolds, fellow firefighters, once his brothers in arms. They had motives: jealousy, ambition, and a desire to climb the ranks. Jake remembered the tension, the whispered conversations that ceased when he entered the room, the sideways glances. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake devised a plan. He would recreate the fires, each one mirroring the original blaze at Station 47. But this time, he would leave behind evidence pointing directly to the true arsonists. The first fire was at an abandoned warehouse, eerily similar to the station's layout. Jake ensured that traces of Mike's fingerprints were found on a gas canister left at the scene. The second fire targeted an old factory, with remnants of Tom's boot prints leading away from the site. The third was a derelict building, where a lighter engraved with Steve's initials was discovered. The authorities were baffled. The fires bore the hallmarks of the Station 47 blaze, and the evidence pointed to the 3 men. Investigations were reopened, and the media frenzy reignited. Jake watched from the shadows as his former colleagues squirmed under the spotlight. He felt a grim satisfaction, but he knew the job wasn't finished. The final ember of his plan was yet to ignite. The fires sent ripples through the city. The news was everywhere. 3 respected firefighters now suspected arsonists. They denied it vehemently, each pointing fingers, each clinging to the thin hope that their past service would shield them from the truth closing in. But Jake Lawson knew better. In the sleepless nights of his years of isolation, he had memorized every detail of the original investigation, every contradiction, every carefully ignored fact. He'd spent months tracking down evidence, learning how to plant it in ways that wouldn't be questioned. Now he watched as the trap he'd laid tightened around them. But he wasn't done. He followed Mike Harris first. Mike had always been the ringleader, the loud one, the one who craved attention. Jake shadowed him, learned his routines, found his vulnerabilities. One cold winter night, Jake followed Mike into a dingy bar at the edge of town. He watched him drink alone, saw the desperation in his eyes. It was easy to imagine how a man like Mike, angry and envious, could have orchestrated the original fire to frame Jake. Jake waited until Mike stumbled out into the alley behind the bar, fumbling for his car keys. In the shadows, Jake struck, knocking Mike unconscious, dragging him into the trunk of a stolen car, and driving him to a secluded spot outside the city. There, Jake tied him to a rusted chair in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by remnants of old construction sites. When Mike woke, panic flashed in his eyes. He recognized Jake immediately. "You," he rasped. "You're insane. I'm cleaning up what you left behind," Jake said coldly. You remember the fire. You remember what you did. Mike struggled, but the ropes held. Jake poured gasoline around the chair, just enough to soak the ground without immediately igniting. He lit a match and let it fall onto the perimeter. Flames crackled to life, forming a ring around Mike. He screamed, but the fire wasn't close enough to burn him, just enough to terrify. Jake stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. This is what it feels like to be trapped, to know the fire is coming for you and there's no way out. Then he doused the flames with a fire extinguisher and vanished into the night, leaving Mike trembling, sobbing, broken. The next day, Mike checked himself into a hospital, his mind unraveling. When investigators arrived with warrants and charges, he was too shattered to protest. Jake's plan was working. Tom Delgado was next. Tom was quieter, more methodical, but greed had always driven him. He'd been the one to plant the accelerant near Jake's locker, the one to falsify the financial records that hinted at a motive. Jake traced him to a suburban home where Tom lived with his family, his 2 children oblivious to the monster their father truly was. Jake waited for the right moment. A night when Tom's wife and kids were out of town. He broke into the house, bypassing the security system with skills learned in his years of planning. He left a single calling card, a smoldering pile of paperwork in the garage, ignited just enough to leave scorch marks but not burn the structure down. At the center of the pile, he placed a photograph. An image of Tom shaking hands with a known criminal from the department's corruption files. When Tom returned home, the smell of smoke greeted him. He found the charred papers, the photograph, and a note. "You'll burn for what you did." Terrified, Tom tried to run, but Jake had already alerted authorities to an anonymous tip linking him to the new fires. By the time Tom was apprehended, the pressure was too much. He confessed to his part in framing Jake, hoping for leniency. Only Steve Reynolds remained, the quietest, most dangerous of them all. Steve had always played the long game, hiding behind a mask of loyalty and hard work. He had been the one to suggest Jake as the fall guy, the one who'd manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses, and made sure Jake's name was the one on every report. Jake followed Steve into the woods one evening, near a secluded hunting cabin Steve frequented. There, Jake confronted him, not with fire this time, but with words. He forced Steve to listen to a recording Jake had secretly made years ago, a conversation between Steve and Mike, laughing about how easy it was to set Jake up, how Jake's life had been destroyed. "You thought you'd get away with it," Jake said softly, his voice echoing through the trees. "You thought no one would ever find out." Steve tried to fight, but Jake was ready. He left Steve bound in the cabin, surrounded by evidence of his involvement in the original fire. He called in a tip, ensuring the authorities would find Steve and the damning evidence together. As Jake walked away from the cabin, the sky above him was painted with the dying light of the setting sun. He felt no remorse, only the weight of justice settling onto his shoulders. The last ember was about to ignite. The city reeled. 3 arrests in as many weeks, each connected by fires eerily similar to the one that had ruined Jake Lawson's life. News anchors spoke with hushed urgency, their faces pale under the studio lights. The words conspiracy and cover-up threaded through every headline. Jake watched from a nameless motel room on the outskirts of town, the television screen flickering with images of his former coworkers, Mike, Tom, and Steve, being led away in handcuffs. His plan had worked perfectly, but something still gnawed at him. The law had taken them, sure, but it hadn't made them feel what he had felt: the betrayal, the humiliation, the slow burn of a life turned to ash. He wanted them to experience that helplessness, to feel the weight of guilt pressing down on their chests with every breath. Mike's breakdown in the hospital had been a start, but Jake wasn't done. He orchestrated the next move from the shadows, using the network of contacts he'd cultivated in his years underground. He found an old acquaintance in the prison system, a man with debts to settle, who ensured Mike's first days in lockup were marked by isolation and intimidation. The walls of his cell seemed to close in, the other inmates taunting him with whispered accusations. Mike cracked completely, screaming into the night, haunted by memories of flames and the sound of Jake's voice. Tom fared no better. Jake sent anonymous packages to his wife, containing copies of bank statements and photos of the charred papers from the garage. The images of her husband's betrayal tore their family apart. She filed for divorce, taking the children and whatever assets she could salvage. Tom, broken and alone, pleaded guilty to his crimes, hoping for a sentence that would spare him the worst of prison. But Steve? Steve was the one Jake had saved for last. Steve was cunning, a man used to manipulating systems and people. He remained calm in custody, confident he could outsmart the investigators, charm the jury, and walk free. Jake anticipated this arrogance. Using a digital trail so carefully crafted it appeared flawless, Jake leaked a series of emails and messages to the press, each one highlighting Steve's involvement in the original cover-up and recent fires. The leak suggested Steve had orchestrated everything, using Mike and Tom as pawns. Public opinion shifted swiftly, painting Steve as the true mastermind. Jake wasn't content with digital evidence alone. He broke into Steve's suburban home while it sat abandoned during the investigation. In the basement, he left behind a single photograph, one taken years ago, showing Steve at a fireman's banquet, his arm around Jake's shoulder, grinning like a man who thought he owned the world. On the back, Jake scrawled a message in permanent marker: "The fire always comes back for you." When Steve learned of the photograph, his facade cracked. His calm exterior shattered in court as he faced damning evidence, witness testimonies, and the overwhelming weight of public outrage. His lawyers' attempts to suppress the evidence failed. His name was dragged through the mud, his reputation incinerated in the court of public opinion. Jake's revenge was nearly complete, but there was one final ember he needed to extinguish. He returned to the charred ruins of Station 47. The building stood hollow and forgotten, its walls scarred and crumbling. In the center of the blackened floor, Jake knelt and poured a small pile of ashes from his pocket, the remnants of the old evidence files he'd used to frame the real arsonists. "This is where it ends," he whispered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and ash, Jake struck a match and set the ashes alight. The flames danced briefly, devouring the paper and releasing smoke into the air, before dying away into nothingness. He turned his back on Station 47, on the ghosts of his past, and walked away. Jake Lawson sat in a diner on the edge of town, watching the headlines roll across the muted TV mounted above the counter. Mike Harris, Tom Delgado, and Steve Reynolds, former firefighters once respected, had been convicted of arson, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Their sentences were harsh. Life behind bars, with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. The camera caught their faces as they were led away in cuffs, their expressions ranging from vacant despair to bitter rage. Jake sipped his black coffee, the taste bitter on his tongue but comforting in its simplicity. This was the moment he had imagined for years, but now that it had arrived, it felt quiet. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress who smiled at him, oblivious to the storm that had consumed his life. Outside, the sky was a soft, bruised purple, the last remnants of daylight bleeding into night. Jake pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and walked down the empty street, the cool air sharp against his skin. He wasn't naive enough to think his work was completely finished. Even with Mike, Tom, and Steve out of the picture, there were others who had whispered and nodded along with the cover-up. But those men had been the architects of his downfall. They had lit the match. They had framed him, ruined his life, and laughed as the flames consumed everything he cared about. Now they were nothing more than smoldering ruins. Jake had made sure of that. He returned to his small apartment, just one room, a worn mattress on the floor, a second-hand chair by the window, a table cluttered with notes and old case files. But tonight it felt different. The weight was gone. The obsession that had gripped him for years had finally burned itself out. He sat at the table and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the original termination notice he'd received all those years ago. Termination due to suspected arson. He held it over a candle, Watch as the edges curled and blackened, the ink blistering into nothingness. When the last of it turned to ash, he crushed it between his fingers and let the wind from the open window scatter it. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The next morning, he visited the cemetery. His father had been a firefighter too, a man who'd taught Jake to respect the flames but never fear them. He knelt by his father's grave, ran his fingers over the inscription. "I made them pay, Dad," he said softly. "I did what no one else would. It's over now." He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, and left behind a small emblem of the fire department, the badge he'd once worn with pride. He didn't need it anymore. The man he had been was gone. What was left was someone leaner, sharper, forged in fire and tempered by loss. As he walked away from the cemetery, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from a former colleague, one of the few who'd believed in his innocence from the beginning. The text was simple. "They're reopening the case. The department's issuing a formal apology. They want to clear your name." Jake stared at the message for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. It wasn't about apologies or public vindication anymore. It wasn't about regaining his old life. He had built something new from the ashes, something no one could take from him. He walked down the cracked sidewalk, past shops just opening for the day, past faces that didn't recognize him anymore. He didn't care. He had his freedom, his peace, and the knowledge that justice, however messy and brutal, had finally been served. Later that day, a controlled fire burned in the training yard behind the station, part of a scheduled drill. Jake stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, watching the flames leap and curl in the controlled environment. The rookies moved with precision, their gear reflecting the firelight, their voices steady and calm. Jake felt a quiet satisfaction as he turned and walked away. The fire no longer held him captive. It was no longer the monster that had haunted his dreams. It was contained, just like his past. As he drove out of town, leaving behind the city that had once destroyed him, the last ember of his old life finally died. And from its ashes, Jake Lawson emerged, free,